January 1944. Western Europe 10,000 feet canopy rattle. Frost laced the cockpit edges as the P-47s carved through the thin blue air, their shadows trembling on the clouds below that glowed orange from tracer fire and sunrise alike. The Jug Big, brutal and loud, shuddered as its turbo supercharger screamed at full power. Captain Fred Christensen of the 56th Fighter Group gripped the throttle tight, feeling the vibration through his gloves. Not fear, but pressure. The kind of pressure only 400 miles per hour and a sky full of enemies could make. Across the channel, German radar screens flickered 12 dots moving east. Messerschmitts lifted from a mist-drowned strip in northern France, their takeoff roll short, their confidence long. To them, the P-47 was a joke, a barn door with wings. Ein Ziegelstein fliegt aber schwer, they laughed, a brick that somehow flies. But the laughter would fade the moment the sky erupted in thunder. The Americans climbed higher oxygen masks, frosting radiostatic thick. Tally-ho, 12 o'clock high. Then came the sound the one Luftwaffe pilots would remember in their sleep, 850 caliber Brownings firing in perfect sync, 100 rounds per second. The air itself split apart, white arcs of light cutting through blue. A Bf-109 dived and vanished into smoke and silence. The canopy rattled again, slower this time, the vibration of triumph, not doubt. By dusk, the Germans who mocked the Jug began whispering a new word, Zerstörer Engel, the destroyer angel. Its weight, once ridiculed, had become armor, its bulk stability, its roar inevitability. Above the frozen continent, the balance had shifted, not with elegance but with force. And in the months to come, those 8 guns would tear apart more than the air. They would tear apart the very idea of who ruled the European sky. They had built their war on finesse, on reflex precision, and instinct sharpened by years of one-on-one duels. To the Luftwaffe of 1943, air combat was still an art form painted in tight turns, deflection angles, and single bursts of cannon fire. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were nimble, almost elegant, the perfect machines for men who believed that mastery came from the individual. That creed had carried them across Poland, France, and the Channel. But by 1944, it had begun to rot beneath the weight of numbers, fatigue, and time. The Americans did not play by that creed. They did not worship the duel. They built a network, not a myth. To the German command, that distinction was invisible at first. They saw only more planes, more crews, more fuel. But behind those statistics was a new kind of machine, industrial, not personal, capable of turning raw recruits into combat pilots faster than the Reich could produce veterans. When the first P-47s appeared over occupied Europe in mid-1943, Luftwaffe officers dismissed them as heavy intruders. Too slow in the climb, they said. Too large to survive a head-on attack. A fine target for our cannon shells, one pilot wrote home from JG-26. And in their first encounters, that arrogance almost seemed justified. The Thunderbolts struggled to stay with the Bf-109s in sharp vertical maneuvers. They lost speed in sustained turns. Their massive radial engines devoured fuel at a rate that would make any German mechanic curse. Yet while the Luftwaffe fought for perfection, the Americans chased consistency. Their doctrine was built not around a single ace, but around the squadron formation discipline, radio coordination, fuel efficiency, and the long game of attrition. If a German wing could muster 180 fighters for a day's sortie, the Americans could launch 400 with 80% of them serviceable again by dawn. The contrast was not glamorous, but it was decisive. The difference hid inside the math. In early 1944, the average Luftwaffe fighter group logged barely 50 flight hours per pilot before loss or replacement. U.S. pilots in Thunderbolt units averaged 130. Each P-47 carried an engine that could run more than 200 combat hours before overhaul. German Daimler-Benz engines often needed full inspection after 60. And every time a German fighter landed with a fuel leak, another 2 stayed grounded, waiting for parts that never came. Still, the pride of the Luftwaffe refused to bend. They had survived years of dominance. They believed agility would always defeat brute strength. That conviction ran deep from instructors who had flown in Spain to the young cadets who still painted kill marks on their tails. They believed the light fighter was the future, swift, pure, and deadly. But over the Channel and across the fields of northern France, that belief began to fracture. The P-47s were not just surviving, they were staying. Each new model stretched the limits farther: drop tanks that doubled range, turbo superchargers that held pressure above 25,000 feet, wing tanks that let them escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Reich's airfields, once sanctuaries, became ambush zones. It was not only about performance, it was about persistence. American fighters flew daily. They could take punishment land, with holes the size of fists, patch up overnight and rise again at dawn. In the eyes of the German engineers who had built sleek, delicate aircraft balanced to the ounce, this was barbaric. To the men who fought against it, it was terrifying. A pilot from JG-11 would later recall in interrogation, "They were everywhere. We could not escape them even when fuel said we must turn home." That was the sound of a doctrine dying. Inside Luftwaffe headquarters, the reports grew darker. Spare parts delayed. New pilots arriving with only a handful of flight hours. Radar intercepts overwhelmed by Allied range and tempo. In February, an analyst in Berlin noted the unthinkable enemy escort fighters now possess longer range than our bombers. The German command tried to adapt, issuing new tactics, calling for heavier armament, high-altitude intercepts, faster climbs. But every adaptation came too late. The P-47's altitude advantage meant that every engagement began on its terms. German fighters could dive and strike once, but then they were trapped below bleeding energy, while the Thunderbolts reformed above them. The Luftwaffe's elegant geometry, the perfect circle of climb, roll, and dive, was broken by brute endurance. Meanwhile, the American factories never slept. Every 20 minutes, another airframe left the Republic plant on Long Island. Fuel convoys crossed the Atlantic under escort. Replacement pilots arrived weekly. Each of those facts eroded the German faith in individual mastery. The Luftwaffe's finest were still deadly, but they were outnumbered, outtrained, and increasingly outflown by men who fought as a system, not as a collection of legends. By spring, the humiliation began to show. In small details, aces refusing to fly with green pilots, mechanics stripping one plane to keep another alive, sorties cancelled for lack of fuel. Aerial heroism, once Germany's proudest myth, was turning into a suicide pact with the past. The P-47s kept coming. Heavier, louder, faster in the dive. They climbed on turbos that whined like sirens. The men who flew them did not seek elegance, they sought results. That was the quiet turning point of the air war, when belief met arithmetic. And as the Luftwaffe's old doctrine finally cracked under the weight of its own glory, the next chapters would be written not in theory, but in the sound of gunfire metal and the canopy's relentless rattle that no one could ignore. Before the Jug became legend, it was an embarrassment. In early 1943, pilots called it clumsy, even dangerous. The first P-47B rolled off the line with a promise of speed, but delivered turbulence, cockpits that fogged at altitude, engines that cooked themselves on climb, controls that froze in a dive. Mechanics cursed the labyrinth of pipes that fed the turbo supercharger. One misrouted line could overboost the engine and blow a cylinder clean through the cowl. During its first month in England, 6 Thunderbolts were lost, not to the enemy, but to their own learning curve. The veterans of the 4th and 56th Fighter Groups joked darkly that flying the P-47 was like wrestling a bear at 30,000 feet. In diary notes recovered from Boxted, a pilot scrawled, "Too heavy to climb, too fast to stop, too proud to quit." Another wrote, "She dives like a stone and God help you if she locks up." Compressibility, the new enemy, became the killer no one could outturn. Once past 500 miles per hour in descent, air pressure built so dense under the wings that the controls stiffened into stone. Pilots pulled and nothing happened. More than one aircraft vanished into the Channel, engines still running. But inside those accidents hid the future. Don't fear the weight, use it. Don't fight the dive, ride it. That became the creed of the Thunderbolt school. Engineers at Republic Aviation started adding dive flaps, strengthening the tail, reshaping the ducts to breathe cooler at altitude. Wind tunnel tests at Wright Field confirmed it. The Jug could pass the barrier where others broke. In one trial, the prototype plunged from 38,000 to 18,000 feet in 36 seconds, crossing 550 miles per hour, faster than any Allied fighter of its day. The pilots learned to flatten the dive only below 20,000 feet when air pressure released its grip. Each lesson cost a life, but each death rewrote the manual. On the German side, the pattern began to puzzle intelligence officers. Reports from JG-11 and JG-26 spoke of American fighters hit repeatedly, yet refusing to fall. Shells tore off ailerons, shredded fuselage panels, and still the Thunderbolt limped home. One intercept pilot radioed after a failed pass. He burns, then he climbs again. What is this monster? Another Luftwaffe engineer examining gun camera footage noted how hits on the nose section failed to ignite fires, no liquid coolant, no explosion. The radial engine simply swallowed damage and kept spinning. To every German technician raised on the logic of precision, thin skins, liquid-cooled efficiency, aerodynamic purity, the P-47 was a heresy. It defied every calculation they respected. It should not have survived its own mass, yet it did. The more they tried to break it, the stronger its legend grew. Meanwhile, on the Allied fields of East Anglia, the jug doctors learned the language of endurance. They stripped engines in the cold and patched bullet holes with beer can aluminum. Each repair made the next one easier. Each field fix became a ritual. Ground crews timed themselves, swap an R-2800 in 4 hours, replace a supercharger in 6. Availability rose past 80%, unthinkable numbers to German maintenance chiefs now scavenging for spark plugs. And still the pilots complained, until the first time they dove through flak and came back alive. Lieutenant Robert Johnson of the 56th was hit 21 times in one sortie, his canopy jammed, fuel line severed, armor glass spiderwebbed with shrapnel. He limped home, crash-landed on fumes, and climbed out shaking. I never believed a plane could take that beating, he said later. Now I know. That single survival changed everything. The squadrons stopped apologizing for their heavy machines. They started flying them, the way they were meant to be flown, fast, steep, brutal. Don't dance with the enemy, crush him. Don't circle dive. Don't hide, absorb. Each pilot learned that altitude was insurance, weight was armor, and speed in the dive was salvation. The lessons written in smoke over the Channel turned into doctrine in every briefing tent across England. In spring 1944, the Thunderbolt's reputation flipped. The same officers who once begged for Spitfires now swore by the jug. German intelligence summaries stopped using the word clumsy. Instead, they spoke of a machine of terrifying durability. Luftwaffe aces began to avoid frontal attacks, choosing instead quick ambushes at dawn or dusk when the heavy American could not use its height. Even then, the advantage slipped away. The P-47's high-altitude power made every dive and ambush reversed. Its 8 guns erased the margin of error that had kept aces alive. Somewhere in those cold months, the mockery died. Every system, the engine, the guns, the armor had been refined by mistakes that killed their own makers. The Thunderbolt was not designed, it was forged. It carried the DNA of failure and survived because of it. And as the Luftwaffe counted its dwindling squadrons, the Americans prepared for something larger. The lessons of pain and fire had turned into equations of dominance. The pilots, who had once feared their own aircraft, now trusted it completely. They were ready for the moment when mockery would turn to silence, ready for the battle that would prove beyond doubt that the jug no longer stumbled. It hunted. June 1944. England's fields glistened with dew, engines roared in the half-light, and the sky above the Channel filled with the blunt silhouettes of Thunderbolts climbing east. The invasion had begun. The world below was chaos ships in the Channel. Gunfire from the beaches, but above it was a storm of metal and determination. The 56th Fighter Group took off from Boxted before dawn, their propellers slicing the fog, their wings heavy with fuel and ammunition. Each aircraft carried 2 drop tanks, each pilot a ritual, a touch on the throttle quadrant, a check of the altimeter, a brief glance at the photo of someone waiting at home. Then they rose into the cold, climbing toward the sound of war. Across the front, Luftwaffe radar stations crackled alive. Feindflugvele Maschinen enemy flight, many aircraft. Controllers traced the dots crawling across their scopes eastward from the Channel, moving faster than their interceptors could climb. At JG-11's airfield near Magdeburg, 12 Bf-109Gs lined up on the grass. Their commander, Major Gunther Rahl, adjusted his goggles and grinned under his mask. The Thunderbolt. Again the Americans' flying fortress of a fighter. He'd shot down dozens of aircraft lighter, quicker, sharper than this. His men laughed over the radio, confident that skill could overcome mass. But this time, the sky had changed. At 20,000 feet, the P-47s leveled off formation, tight sun flashing on silver wings. The pilots could see their own contrails stretching behind them like lines drawn across a map of the war. Vultures inbound 3 o'clock high came the call. The Germans were there diving fast, their silhouettes thin and angled, their cannon barrels already glinting. The first burst tore through the formation. One Thunderbolt spiraled away, smoke trailing. But the rest did not scatter. They held formation engines, roaring wings steady, and then unleashed the storm. 8 Brownings per plane opened up at once, a river of fire that turned the sky white. The tracers converged in a single glowing cone, a wall of heat and metal that shredded air itself. For the German pilots, it was like flying into a furnace. The 109s were built for grace, for precise maneuvers, not for surviving the brute wall of lead that came screaming toward them. A wing tore off one fighter in mid-roll, another caught fire instantly, its canopy exploding outward as the pilot ejected too low to live. Within minutes, the hunters had become the hunted. Captain Christensen's radio crackled, 1 down, 2 burning, and he could see them falling through thin white clouds. He pushed forward on the stick, the Jug's nose dropping, his dive angle steepening. The altimeter spun. He saw a Bf-109 dart below him, trying to escape into the haze. The P-47 fell like judgment, 500 miles per hour and growing. The canopy rattled, the air thickened, and he pressed the trigger. The guns answered with thunder, the tracers rising to meet the fleeing shape. A flash, a bloom of orange, then nothing but smoke and debris drifting through cloud. When Christensen pulled out of the dive, the altimeter read 6,000 feet. The airframe groaned, but it held. He could feel the shuddering power of the Jug, still alive, still stable. Above him the sky was littered with black specks, his squadron reforming the battle already won. He exhaled into the mask, the oxygen hissing loud in his ears, and for a brief moment, the only sound was the canopy rattle. By midday, the pattern was clear across the front. The P-47s no longer escorted timidly, they ruled the airspace. German bomber crews reported attacks from impossible heights. The Thunderbolt's dive speed made traditional tactics useless. Its pilots didn't turn to fight. They climbed dove and struck like artillery shells from the heavens. The Luftwaffe had built its doctrine on maneuver. The Americans had built theirs on momentum, and momentum crushed maneuver every time. At Magdeburg, Luftwaffe ground crews waited in silence for planes that never came back. Of the 12 that had taken off that morning, only 5 landed, and 2 were too damaged to fly again. One mechanic knelt beside a riddled fuselage, fingers tracing bullet holes through the skin. "A monster," he muttered. They built a monster. From that day forward, German radio intercepts spoke of the P-47 with new caution. No longer brick, no longer slug. The code name changed, Donnerkeil Thunderbolt indeed. Back in England, Allied intelligence officers compiled the day's reports. Loss rates for Thunderbolts less than 1% per mission. For German interceptors, nearly 3. Ground attacks were even more devastating. The P-47's new bomb racks allowed each aircraft to carry a 500-pound payload, transforming it from high-altitude escort to low-level executioner. Rail lines, trucks, fuel dumps all fell victim to the Jug's relentless rhythm. The pilots adapted as fast as their aircraft. They learned to use altitude as weapon, not refuge. A German fighter diving from above might win the first strike, but when the P-47 rolled into the same dive, it became unstoppable. The Jug's density turned gravity into ally. In the dive, its speed made it untouchable. In the climb, its turbo kept breathing long after the German engines gasped for air. The war in the sky had found its turning point, and it belonged to physics, not pride. Over the next weeks, the transformation was complete. The air war over Western Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. Every daylight raid reached its target. Bombers that once died by the dozens now crossed the Rhine and returned with escorts still intact. The Germans could no longer mass their fighters for counterattack. Fuel shortages and fear kept them scattered. The P-47s hunted alone or in pairs, roaming highways and rail yards with the confidence of predators who no longer expected resistance. To the soldiers on the ground, the Jug became legend. Its shadow brought both salvation and terror, depending on which flag you fought under. U.S. infantry cheered when they saw its wide wings banking low, a silver guardian above the mud. German columns broke formation at the sound of its engine, deep hammering, unmistakable. The same bulk that had drawn laughter a year before now symbolized dominance. One Luftwaffe ace captured after a forced landing said quietly during interrogation, "We lost the sky when they stopped fearing us." He was right. From that point on, the P-47 was not just an aircraft, it was a moving law of war. Its 8 guns carved geometry into the sky, each burst a proof that speed and resilience once mocked had rewritten the rules. Over Magdeburg, over Normandy, over every burning rail yard from Calais to Kassel, the same sound echoed again and again, the thunder of 50 calibers, the canopies rattle, the brief silence afterward, as another German plane fell. That silence marked the shift. Mockery had turned to dread, and dread into myth. By autumn, even German intelligence memos spoke the truth plainly. Enemy fighter type P-47 cannot be driven from airspace. Engage only with advantage. But advantage had become a memory. The flying brick had found its purpose. What once fell like a stone now ruled like one dropped from heaven. Every dive, every climb, every rattle of its canopy told the same story, that the age of the nimble ace was ending, and the age of the machine had begun. And somewhere over the gray plains of Germany, as the contrails faded in the dying light, the Jug's shadow stretched longer than any legend could. By the end of summer 1944, the Jug had outgrown its first identity. What began as a blunt escort fighter had evolved into a weapon of transformation, a machine that could climb into the stratosphere 1 hour and flatten a convoy the next. In hangars across East Anglia and Normandy, ground crews spoke of the new D-series with reverence, bubble canopy, paddle blade prop, upgraded turbo ducting, and redesigned wings with bomb racks that could carry a full ton of ordnance. The P-47 was no longer merely a guardian of bombers. It had become a hammer against the ground war itself. The new design looked deceptively familiar. Its silhouette was still heavy, its lines still ungraceful, but the changes were revolutionary. The bubble canopy turned the pilot into an all-seeing predator. The paddle blade propeller gave the machine 900 extra feet per minute in climb. Drop tanks hung beneath its wings like muscle, turning its endurance from 3 hours to 7. It could range from Normandy to Berlin and back again, without gasping for fuel. Suddenly, what had once been mocked as sluggish became the most flexible aircraft in Europe. The Germans, reeling from months of losses, were forced to watch as the same monster that had shattered their aces now descended upon their roads, trains, and columns with surgical fury. On August mornings, the fields shook with takeoffs. Dozens of P-47s lifted into gray skies, forming silver webs that stretched over France. Below them moved the wreckage of retreating armies, smoke-twisted vehicles, broken bridges. When the Thunderbolts rolled into attack, they came in pairs, one marking, one striking. Rockets tore through armor, 500-pound bombs cratered crossroads, and 50 caliber fire stitched through convoys until nothing moved but dust. German troops began calling them Jabo, short for Jagdbomber, spoken with both hate and fear. Entire units froze in place when the engine's deep growl rolled over the horizon. A field officer's letter from the Wehrmacht's 7th Army captured it in one line. They fall from the sun like stones, and the earth itself explodes. That sound, the tearing roar of 8 Brownings in unison, became a language everyone understood. Villagers knew to dive for cellars. Tank crews learned that smoke was no disguise. There was no safe hour anymore. The Jug hunted in the dawn mist, and again at twilight, using the low light to hide its descent until the horizon bloomed with fire. What made it even more relentless was tempo. Each Thunderbolt squadron averaged nearly 60 sorties per pilot per month. Engines were swapped in hours, not days. Ground crews developed rhythms that bordered on choreography, fuel reload, launch, repeat. American logistics made the impossible routine. Rail depots in England funneled ammunition and parts to forward strips in Normandy faster than the Luftwaffe could refuel a single Stoffel. For the German airmen who survived, the realization was unbearable. The war they'd trained for, one of duels and precision strikes, had turned into industrial extermination from above. They no longer met equals in the sky. They faced a system designed to erase them. Those who dared to engage discovered that the Jug could outdive them, outrun them in descent, and kill them before they could even close range. Those who stayed low risked becoming targets for its bombs. There was nowhere left to fight that the P-47 did not reach. Meanwhile, the Allied command adapted as well. The 9th Air Force began assigning Thunderbolt wings directly to ground armies, turning them into flying artillery. In 1 week during August, P-47 units destroyed over 1,000 vehicles, half a dozen bridges, and an entire German armored column attempting to retreat from Falaise. Pilots described the carnage with a mixture of awe and horror. "We flew at treetop level 1, said, and the road burned from end to end. In that inferno, the reputation of the Jug hardened into legend. It was indestructible, insatiable, and omnipresent. Where a German truck moved, a P-47 followed. Where a bridge stood, it fell. Where a tank fired, it vanished beneath dust and flame. Even the Allied infantry began to measure time by its shadow. When the Jugs came, we moved. The soldiers trusted that if the sky thundered, the ground would soon be theirs. Yet victory brought its own unease. The same pilots who had once feared the Jug's mass now began to feel its exhaustion. Missions blurred together, the rhythm too fast to rest. Engines overheated, nerves frayed, and weather took its toll. One storm in September scattered an entire formation over Belgium. 3 planes lost to lightning, 2 to low fuel. The machine endured better than the men. Still, they flew because the war demanded it, and the Jug was now indispensable. By the fall of 1944, the Thunderbolt had become more than a weapon. It was the muscle of Allied advance. Every bridgehead it softened, every supply line it destroyed, paved the road to the Rhine. From the airfields of France to the forward strips near the Ardennes, the deep roar of its Pratt & Whitney engine became the pulse of Allied momentum. The Luftwaffe could no longer match its pace or presence. Even their newest jets could not appear everywhere at once. The Jug could. A German mechanic at Merseburg wrote in his log, before abandoning his base, "They fill the air, and even the silence carries their echo." That echo stretched across Europe, rolling from ruined cities to open plains. In the Jug's sound lay the proof that the war had shifted forever, no longer a contest of duels, but of endurance, production, and relentless pressure. And as autumn bled into winter, the P-47 stood ready for its next transformation. The machine that once struggled to climb now owned the sky. The fighter that once protected bombers now cleared the path for armies. The laughter of the Luftwaffe had long since vanished, replaced by silence broken only by that unmistakable rumble, a signal that power once mocked had become unstoppable. The Jug had turned from protector to avenger, and in the months to come, it would turn Europe's retreating horizon into the last proof that the age of mockery was over and the age of dominance had arrived. Behind every flight of thunderbolts that tore across the gray skies of Europe, there existed an empire of noise hammers, cranes, conveyor belts, the endless hum of American industry. The war's true miracle wasn't in the air. It was in the rhythm of factories that never slept. From the foundries of Detroit to the assembly lines of Long Island, the P-47 was born not from artistry, but from repetition, perfected into ritual. A fuselage every 12 minutes, an engine tested every 40, a new wing rolled from a crate to a railcar before the previous one cooled. The Republic plant in Farmingdale pulsed like a living organism, shifts overlapping, welders trading places with riveters, inspectors working under fluorescent glare until dawn. Each crate bore a destination, Boxted Kings, North Carrington, forward airfields that stretched like arteries into occupied Europe. Every bolt that left the United States already had a home, already had a serial number waiting in a maintenance log across the channel. It wasn't magic, it was mathematics. This was how America fought its wars, through scale, rhythm, and interchangeability. If one engine failed, another replaced it before sunrise. If a plane crashed, its replacement crossed the Atlantic within weeks. The Luftwaffe fought with pride. The Allies fought with logistics. And logistics never slept. In the hangars of the 9th Air Force, the term turnaround took on new meaning. Ground crews competed not for kills, but for speed, how fast a Thunderbolt could land, refuel, reload, and take off again. They shaved seconds like surgeons cutting away weakness. One team could swap an R-2800 engine in 4 hours flat. Another could replace a bent propeller before the pilot even finished his debrief. Spare parts came by the ton, shipped in wooden crates marked by region: New York to Southampton, Liverpool to Cherbourg. Every hour something moved toward the front. Every movement fed the machine. In contrast, the Luftwaffe's arteries were clogged. Allied bombers had shredded rail lines and depots, starving squadrons of the oil and ammunition they needed just to exist. Mechanics scavenged wrecks for parts. Fuel was so scarce that aces were grounded while recruits flew training sorties on borrowed gasoline. By the end of 1944, some German pilots logged barely 20 hours of flight time before being sent into combat. In the American camps, trainees exceeded that before even touching European soil. It wasn't skill that was decisive anymore. It was momentum. At the training fields in Florida, Arizona, and Oklahoma, young men sat in rows of simulators that replicated every dial, every gauge, every rattle of the canopy. They practiced radio discipline, emergency dives, gunnery angles, the art of staying alive through procedure, not improvisation. Each class graduated hundreds. Each graduate replaced another who fell. The system absorbed losses and returned strength in kind. Lose 10, return 20. That was the quiet arithmetic of victory, the arithmetic the Luftwaffe could never match. Even fuel became a weapon. In Louisiana and Texas, refineries turned out high-octane blends so volatile they required armored trains to carry them to port. Tankers under naval escort crossed the Atlantic, delivering the lifeblood of the air war, 150-octane fuel that made the P-47's turbo roar with almost jet-like ferocity. At British airfields, drums of the same fuel lined the taxiways like sentinels, each one a promise that the next sortie would launch on time. When the fog lifted and the ground crews heard that deep thunder roll from the cowl, they knew the system still lived. Inside that system, every man mattered, but no man was irreplaceable. The P-47 was the embodiment of that philosophy, built in pieces, maintained in sections, modular from prop tip to tail. A damaged wing from Boxed Head could fit a fuselage from Evansville without a single adjustment. The manuals demanded uniformity so strict that even paint thickness was regulated. It wasn't beauty, it was obedience to process. And from that obedience came power. For the pilots, this invisible engine of production meant certainty. They never doubted whether their planes would be ready. They never wondered if the parts would arrive. They woke, they flew, they fought, and when they returned with their jugs scarred and scorched, another waited gleaming under hangar lights. Behind them stood an army of anonymous hands, women riveting wings, boys hauling crates, machinists turning out the bolts that would hold one more pilot's life together. They would never see the front, but the front would not exist without them. Meanwhile, in Germany, silence grew louder. Refineries bombed to rubble, synthetic plants burning, train lines torn apart. The Luftwaffe's last reserves of aviation fuel dwindled to weeks. Pilots practiced in classrooms, tracing dogfights on chalkboards they would never fly. Some even pedaled bicycles to the airfields because the trucks had no gasoline. When they finally took off, their missions lasted minutes, their engines coughing on low-octane desperation. Above them roared the Thunderbolts, full tanks and full confidence. That imbalance became the war's heartbeat. The P-47 didn't just fight, it represented a civilization's industrial rhythm turned against its enemy. Every sortie was a manifestation of that rhythm, engines humming, fuel lines, flowing supply ships crossing oceans, factories lighting the night. Germany could still produce great machines, but America had mastered something greater, the choreography of endless replacement. By winter 1944, the difference was absolute. On paper, both sides still flew. In reality, only one side could sustain the act. The Luftwaffe had become a ghost force, scattered, exhausted, grounded by arithmetic. The Thunderbolts, meanwhile, flew with the confidence of an army that could never run out of breath. In the final weeks before the Battle of the Bulge, the airfields of France thundered day and night. Pilots ate cold rations beside their planes, sleeping in tents as mechanics worked by floodlight. Engines roared, turbos screamed, and the canopy rattled, a symphony of machinery playing the music of momentum. When dawn came, the sky filled again with silver wings. It was no longer about courage. It was about endurance, the quiet, relentless endurance of a nation that had turned its factories into weapons and its process into faith. The P-47 was the gospel of that endurance, proof that victory belonged not to the boldest, but to the most prepared. And as the war neared its end, even the exhausted pilots could feel it, the rhythm of a machine that would outlast them all, the sound of power without pause, the steady pulse of an empire made of noise and light. When the war finally slowed, and the smoke above Europe thinned into silence, the air still carried the faint echo of engines, the ghost hum of 1,000 thunderbolts that had once torn the sky apart. Across fields that had once been runways, children played among the grooves of tires impressed into old mud. The war had ended, but its machines lingered, hulks of aluminum, gleaming under rain wings, folded propellers, still each one a relic of the storm that had remade the world. For the Luftwaffe, it ended in fragments. Squadrons that had begun the war with aces and legends now stood empty, their hangars stripped, their officers gone. The last surviving pilots wrote in weary journals more like confession than record. "We did not lose the fight, we ran out of fuel to fight it," one wrote in April 1945. They could lose 10 and come back with 20. We could win the day and still lose the war. Their enemy had become a system too vast to exhaust. The P-47 was the embodiment of that truth, an aircraft built not for glory, but for endurance, and in endurance lay dominance. The numbers told the story more clearly than any speech could. Over 15,600 Thunderbolts built. More than 3,700 confirmed air-to-air victories in Europe. A loss rate under 0.5% per sortie. By the time Germany surrendered, there were so many jugs across the continent that they were parked wingtip to wingtip waiting for orders that never came. What Germany had built on precision, America had built on persistence. One side believed in brilliance, the other believed in replacement. And in the arithmetic of total war, replacement always won. In the years that followed, the jug did not fade, it evolved. Stripped of its camouflage, it became the bridge to a new age. The Republic engineers who once riveted Thunderbolts would go on to design jets. The F-84 Thunderjet, then the F-105 Thunderchief. Each one carrying the same philosophy forward: power through durability, dominance through systems, not individuals. The lessons learned in Europe became the blueprints of the Cold War aircraft, designed for survivability engines built for constant strain, and logistics that could feed wars measured not in days but in decades. Even in peace, its spirit remained visible. Farmers bought surplus P-47s for scrap, cutting the wings for aluminum to rebuild roofs and barns. Others went to museums or air shows. Their engines polished, their skins restored to the shine of their youth. In Normandy, one stood in a hangar painted in the colors of the 56th Fighter Group. Visitors gathered each summer to watch it start. The pilot primed the cylinders, turned the magnetos, and for a moment the past returned, the deep thrum, the turbo's shriek, the canopy rattle, that unmistakable sound of power. Veterans wept quietly, hearing not just a machine, but a memory. For those who survived, the jug became more than a plane. It was a symbol of how war had changed. It marked the end of the romantic duel, the passing of the era of aces. The Thunderbolt did not ask for elegance, and it offered none. It fought by mass, by system, by relentless rhythm. Its story was the story of industrial warfare distilled into a single shape: a round nose, broad wings, and a roar that silenced everything else. And in that silence, a truth remained. Victory in the modern world did not belong to those who flew with grace, but to those who built with endurance. The P-47 proved that machines, when multiplied by will and organization, could change destiny itself. Today, when one of the few surviving Thunderbolts takes to the air, the crowd still looks up. The sound is deeper than they expect, ancient and alive. As the aircraft banks and glints in the sun, the rattle of its canopy carries across the field. It is the same sound that echoed above Normandy, above Magdeburg, above the ruins of Europe. The final heartbeat of an age when metal and men became one, and the sky itself trembled beneath the weight of a new kind of power.